On a sweltering afternoon in early June, the fourth day of that month in 1943, a convoy of naval vessels made its way into the sprawling harbor at Norfolk, Virginia. The ships had crossed the Atlantic over 14 grueling days, carrying human cargo that would have seemed unthinkable just months earlier. Below decks and on crowded berths, 2,500 men wearing the uniforms of the German Afrika Korps contemplated what awaited them on American soil. These were not just ordinary soldiers. They were men who had fought under Rommel in the scorching deserts of North Africa, who had believed themselves part of an invincible force, and who had absorbed years of propaganda about the nation they were now approaching as prisoners. The mental preparation these Germans had undergone before disembarking centered on one assumption: America would be hostile, perhaps violently so. They anticipated the treatment they imagined Allied prisoners received in their own camps back home. Shackles seemed inevitable. Physical abuse appeared likely. The jeering crowds they expected would mirror the hatred they had been told Americans harbored for all Germans. Instead, as the gangplanks lowered and boots began their descent onto American concrete, something entirely unexpected unfolded before their disbelieving eyes. The dock workers moving cargo appeared to be collaborating seamlessly, but what struck the Germans immediately was the composition of these work crews. Black laborers and white workers stood shoulder to shoulder, calling out instructions to one another, coordinating the movement of massive crates with practiced efficiency. This simple fact contradicted a cornerstone of the ideology they had been fed. The propaganda machine back in Berlin had insisted that America was fracturing along racial lines, that the country was on the verge of internal collapse due to its diverse population. Yet here was evidence of cooperation that seemed effortless and natural. Women occupied positions of responsibility throughout the dock area. They weren't performing auxiliary tasks or clerical duties. These women operated heavy machinery, guiding massive cranes with movements that suggested long experience and complete competence. Some wore overalls stained with grease and oil, their hair tied back in practical fashion, directing operations with authority that commanded immediate respect from their male counterparts. For soldiers raised in a society that increasingly relegated women to roles defined by the 3 Ks, this was another jarring contradiction of everything they had been taught about American weakness and disorder. Music reached their ears from somewhere beyond the immediate dock area. A brass ensemble was playing cheerful melodies that seemed jarringly out of place in what should have been a grim transfer of enemy prisoners. The tunes were upbeat, almost celebratory, as though this were an ordinary day rather than a moment of national conflict. The psychological effect of this musical backdrop was profound. It suggested a nation so confident in its position, so secure in its strength, that it could afford to be casual even in the presence of its enemies. The aroma of fresh coffee and fried dough wafted across the pier from vendor carts positioned near the processing areas. For men who had spent months on reduced rations in North Africa, who had grown accustomed to the thin soup and hard bread that constituted field provisions, these smells were almost overwhelming. The scent spoke of abundance, of a civilian population that could still enjoy such luxuries while prosecuting a global war. This was not supposed to be possible, according to the briefings they had received about America's industrial and agricultural limitations. The physical infrastructure of Norfolk Naval Base stretched beyond what most of these prisoners had ever seen in a single location. The installation covered more than 4,000 acres of developed land, with countless piers extending into the water, massive warehouses lining the shore, and dry docks capable of servicing the largest vessels afloat. Many of these Germans had passed through Hamburg, which the regime had celebrated as one of Europe's greatest ports. Yet Norfolk dwarfed it in both scale and activity. The cranes alone rose to heights that seemed excessive, their mechanical arms swinging pallets and containers with rhythmic precision that suggested unlimited resources and endless capacity. Records from that period document the staggering volume of material passing through this single American port. Throughout 1943, Norfolk processed more than 30 million tons of cargo. To put this in perspective, Hamburg's best pre-war year had managed roughly 1/3 of that tonnage. The implications were obvious to anyone with eyes to see. American industrial capacity was not merely matching German production. It was overwhelming it by margins that suggested an entirely different order of magnitude. The prisoners could see this truth written in the endless stacks of crates, the perpetual motion of machinery, and the calm efficiency with which civilian workers managed operations that should have required military supervision. The American guards assigned to escort the prisoners exhibited behavior that seemed almost incomprehensible. They carried weapons, certainly. Rifles were present. Pistols were holstered at their belts. But the casual manner in which these guards bore their arms suggested they felt no genuine threat from their charges. Many had rifles slung loosely over shoulders rather than held at ready positions. The guards chatted among themselves, occasionally shared jokes that provoked laughter, and approached their duties with the air of men performing routine tasks rather than handling dangerous enemies. No chains materialized. No prisoner found himself shackled to another. Instead, they were marshaled in orderly groups with verbal instructions and minimal physical control. One captured officer would later commit to writing his astonishment at this treatment. The notation in his diary expressed disbelief that the Americans permitted them to observe so much of the port's operations, the trains waiting beyond the docks, and even the distant factories whose smokestacks were visible across the industrial landscape. This openness seemed strategically foolish unless it was deliberate, unless the Americans wanted them to see, unless the display of strength was itself a weapon more potent than any restriction or humiliation could be. The sensory experience of those first hours on American soil created memories that would persist long after the war ended. The metallic tang of salt air, mixed with industrial smells, created a distinctive atmosphere that was simultaneously harsh and vibrant. The clang of metal against metal as cargo was loaded and unloaded provided a rhythmic soundtrack to their transition from ship to shore. Amid these industrial sounds came the incongruous notes of civilian life, laughter from dock workers on their break, the cry of a newspaper vendor announcing headlines, and persistently, almost surreally, the voice of a radio announcer calling a baseball game that was apparently underway somewhere in the city. The broadcast sports commentary became a focal point for many prisoners. The announcer's excited voice would rise and fall, describing plays and scores in a game that meant nothing to them but everything about the culture they were entering. The Yankees were leading someone by 3 runs to 1, according to the voice. This casual reference to sporting entertainment in the middle of a global conflict seemed to encapsulate everything that was different about America. This was a nation that could maintain its peacetime pleasures even while mobilizing for total war. Many prisoners experienced a profound internal conflict during these first hours. The propaganda they had absorbed for years painted a specific picture of America. It was supposed to be a nation torn apart by class warfare, paralyzed by unemployment, unable to unite its disparate peoples toward common purpose. The images they had been shown depicted breadlines, labor unrest, and civil disorder. Yet the reality before their eyes told a completely different story. Here was prosperity that seemed almost offensive in its casual display. Energy poured from every direction. Unity was evident in the cooperation between different types of workers. The supposed weakness of American society was nowhere to be found. One sergeant managed to smuggle out a brief note during this period that captured the dissonance perfectly. His scrawled words questioned what peacetime must be like in America if this was how the nation functioned during wartime. If this abundance, this efficiency, this casual confidence was the American way of prosecuting a conflict, what must their normal circumstances look like? The question was rhetorical, but devastating in its implications. Everything the sergeant had believed about German superiority was being challenged by simple observation. Norfolk was merely the entry point, the first breach in the wall of belief that had been constructed around these men's understanding of the world. They had not yet seen the interior of an American prisoner camp. They had not yet experienced the full measure of American agricultural and industrial capacity. They had not yet tasted the food or received the medical care that awaited them. But these first impressions mattered enormously because they established a pattern that would only intensify. The unexpected sight of American normalcy, of a society functioning with apparent ease despite the demands of global war, began immediately to erode the propaganda-constructed image they carried of a weak and crumbling opponent. The real journey of transformation, however, would begin when they left the port behind and began moving inland. Because what awaited them beyond Norfolk would prove even more challenging to their preconceptions than anything they had seen at the docks. The trains that would carry them deeper into America would not take secret routes or hide them from the civilian population. Instead, the journey would become an extended lesson in American openness and strength, a rolling demonstration of everything their leaders had told them was impossible. Passenger coaches awaited the prisoners just beyond the Norfolk Pier area. Not the boxcars or freight wagons they had anticipated. Not the cramped cattle trucks that would have been used for such transport in Europe. Actual passenger coaches with upholstered seats and windows that opened to admit fresh air. The Germans boarded with confusion evident on their faces. In every European context they understood, the movement of prisoners meant the minimum of accommodation. Yet here they found themselves in circumstances that approximated normal civilian travel, as though they were passengers rather than captives. An American guard gestured toward the interior of the coach with casual authority. The instruction was simple and delivered without hostility. Find seats wherever you like. No assigned positions, no deliberate discomfort. Just the practical direction to settle themselves for what would be a long journey. The prisoners complied, still waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the moment when American hospitality would reveal itself as a cruel deception. That moment never came. As the train began its westward journey from Virginia, the route it followed took no pains to avoid populated areas or hide the prisoners from public view. Instead, the train cut directly through towns and cities, past farmland and factories, following the most direct path to their destination. Through the open windows, the Germans found themselves spectators to American civilian life in all its mundane detail. Men were mowing lawns in front of neat houses. Children were consuming ice cream cones while walking down sidewalks. Young couples strolled together with the easy intimacy of people who felt safe in their world. At Richmond's Union Station, the train paused for routine operations. The platform was crowded with American civilians going about their business. Some noticed the German prisoners and stared with obvious curiosity. But the stares were not hostile. Several people actually waved, not in mockery, but in what seemed like simple human acknowledgement. One corporal who survived the war would later describe the sensation as feeling invisible, despite being completely visible. Nobody shouted insults, nobody spat or made threatening gestures. The prisoners seemed to matter so little to these civilians that they could be safely ignored or acknowledged with casual friendliness. The abundance visible from the train windows was staggering in its implications. Factories passed by with smokestacks releasing steady plumes of exhaust, indicating full production schedules. There were no signs of the material shortages that plagued German industry. Automobile dealerships appeared regularly along the route, their lots filled with new trucks awaiting buyers. Near Baltimore, the train tracks passed close enough to the Glenn L. Martin aircraft manufacturing facility that prisoners could actually see inside the enormous building through its many windows. The assembly lines were visible. Partially completed bombers stood in various stages of construction, dozens of them arrayed in rows that seemed to stretch forever. The Martin plant alone was producing more than 30 B-26 Marauder bombers every week during this period. To put this in perspective, Germany's Heinkel factories required roughly a month to produce the same number of aircraft, and that was when operations were running smoothly without the disruptions caused by Allied bombing raids. The Americans were not hiding this information from their prisoners. In fact, the opposite seemed to be true. The route had been chosen deliberately to showcase American industrial might. The message was clear without being spoken. Look at what we can build. Look at how much we can produce. Understand the futility of continuing to resist. Even small details accumulated into a powerful impression. Station dining facilities were visible through windows at various stops. American passengers sat at counters eating hamburgers that appeared almost obscenely large, piled high with fresh vegetables and accompaniments. The meals looked impossibly rich to men whose daily rations had consisted primarily of black bread and watery soup for months. At one particular stop, a prisoner observed a porter taking a bite from a bright red apple and then casually discarding the half-eaten fruit into a waste bin. This single act of waste struck the observer with tremendous force. He would remember it decades later as a moment of revelation about American abundance. The ability to throw away food suggested resources beyond anything he had experienced. Fresh coffee aroma drifted into the train cars at every station stop. The smell was torture for men who had not tasted real coffee in months, but it was also revelation. If even prisoners in transit could smell this luxury, what must American civilians be consuming on a regular basis? The olfactory evidence of prosperity was almost more convincing than the visual proof. The statistics of American transportation capacity provided context for what the prisoners were witnessing. By 1943, the United States rail network was moving more than 2.5 million passengers every single day, while simultaneously handling freight tonnage that dwarfed Germany's capacity. Coal production in America stood at 600 million tons annually. Germany's output was less than half that figure. These were not abstract numbers to the prisoners. They were visible realities in every coal car they passed, every freight train they saw loaded with raw materials, every water tower and switching station that marked another node in an impossibly vast network. The journey itself carried a psychological message that went beyond mere logistics. These prisoners were not being hidden from the American public. The government clearly felt no anxiety about civilians seeing enemy soldiers in their midst. This confidence was itself a form of power. It suggested a population so unified and secure that the presence of enemies within their borders posed no threat to morale or civil order. American newspapers during this period occasionally carried small human interest stories about German prisoners spotted at railway stations. The articles often noted the youth of the captives, the neat condition of their uniforms despite their circumstances, and the evident weariness on their faces. Some accounts mentioned acts of kindness from civilians who pressed sandwiches or other food through train windows. For the prisoners, this openness was simultaneously humiliating and thought-provoking. One diary fragment that survived the war expressed the sentiment plainly. In Germany, we would never permit captive enemies to observe our cities or come near our civilian population. Here, they display us openly. It is shameful and strange, but it forces us to question what we have been told. If America fears nothing from letting us see their country, perhaps their strength is greater than we were led to believe. Doubt, once introduced, spread through the prisoner population like an infection. If American propaganda about their own weakness was false, what else might be false? If the racial divisions that were supposed to be tearing America apart were not evident, if women were capable of operating heavy machinery despite their supposed inferiority, if abundance existed where there should be scarcity, then perhaps the entire worldview they had been taught was built on lies. These questions could not be easily dismissed because they were prompted not by enemy propaganda, but by direct observation. The trains eventually reached their destinations at various prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the American interior. As the Germans disembarked and prepared to enter captivity proper, they braced themselves once again for the harsh treatment they assumed must be coming. Surely the relative comfort of the journey had been an aberration. Surely the real nature of American captivity would now be revealed. Instead, they were about to encounter another set of contradictions that would shake their understanding even more fundamentally. Because American treatment of prisoners would begin with something as simple and radical as quality medical care. Processing into the camps involved medical examinations that immediately differentiated American captivity from what these men had expected. Doctors waited with examination equipment already prepared. Nurses stood ready with medications and supplies. The facilities themselves were clean, well lit, and properly equipped. For soldiers who had witnessed the primitive medical conditions common in field hospitals, who had seen comrades die from infections that might have been treatable under better circumstances, this was an immediate indication that something different was happening here. Red Cross parcels filled storerooms adjacent to the processing areas. The packages were stacked in organized rows, each stamped with appropriate dietary markings. Some bore Hebrew lettering indicating kosher contents. Others were marked for Muslim prisoners from North African units, ensuring halal dietary requirements could be met. The availability of such specialized provisions suggested a level of care and attention to detail that seemed excessive for enemy prisoners. Yet here it was, tangible and real. The true revelation came with the medications. American military medical services had access to penicillin in quantities that seemed magical to anyone familiar with European medical practice. By 1944, American pharmaceutical production had reached more than 20 billion units of penicillin annually. Germany, by contrast, had managed to produce only a few hundred kilograms of crude forms of the drug throughout the entire war. The difference was not merely quantitative. It represented a fundamental gap in medical capability that had profound implications for survival rates. Watching an American medic inject penicillin into a fellow prisoner who had developed an infection was a transformative experience for many Germans. They had seen men die from infected wounds in North Africa because effective antibiotics were unavailable. Now, as prisoners, they were receiving a medicine that could have saved their comrades' lives if only they had been fighting for the other side. One survivor would later write that they treated us with this miracle drug as though we were their own soldiers. We could not comprehend such a thing. It suggested a value placed on human life that transcended the categories of friend and enemy. Swiss inspectors from the International Red Cross, who toured American POW camps, documented the medical facilities with thoroughness. A report from one inspection of Camp Hearn in Texas noted that medical care available to prisoners equaled and in some respects exceeded the treatment provided to American soldiers themselves. This was not hyperbole. It was a factual assessment based on direct observation of facilities, medications, and outcomes. The Americans were genuinely committed to providing quality healthcare to their captives. German physicians who had been captured were permitted to continue practicing medicine under American supervision. They worked alongside American doctors in camp hospitals, treating their own countrymen while observing American medical techniques. The interaction between former enemies in a professional medical context created opportunities for knowledge exchange that would have been impossible in any other setting. Captured German doctors learned American surgical methods. American physicians discovered techniques that had been developed in German medical schools. The collaboration was conducted with professional respect that transcended the war. One German doctor named Wilhelm Kranz kept detailed notes throughout his captivity. His writings described the collegial atmosphere in the camp hospital with evident surprise. No one mocked our medical training or treated us as inferior. They asked questions about our methods and shared their own techniques freely. It was not a relationship of victor and vanquished, but of colleagues wearing white coats. This professional respect had deeper implications than mere courtesy. It suggested that American confidence extended even to acknowledging that enemies might have knowledge worth learning. The sensory environment of the camp hospitals reinforced the message of quality care. The sharp smell of carbolic acid used for sterilization was familiar from any medical setting, but the abundance of disinfectants suggested no shortage of supplies. Electric fans hummed constantly in the Texas heat, maintaining air circulation in the recovery wards. Sheets on the hospital beds were crisp white cotton, laundered regularly and replaced frequently. These were material comforts largely absent from field hospitals in any theater of the war. To prisoners, the contrast between these facilities and what they had known was stark enough to silence even those most committed to believing in German superiority. Statistical records from American military archives document the scale of medical care provided to prisoners. More than 16,000 German captives required hospitalization during 1943 alone. Survival rates exceeded 95%, a figure that compared very favorably with outcomes in the best civilian hospitals. Within the German medical system, survival rates for serious conditions like compound fractures or pneumonia often fell below 70% due to limited resources and the pressures of wartime conditions. The contrast was significant enough to be noticed by prisoners who had any medical knowledge. But medical care was only one component of the larger paradox these men encountered. Food became another daily demonstration of American abundance. Camp mess halls posted menus written in German, a small courtesy that nonetheless indicated attention to prisoner comfort. The daily caloric intake for POWs averaged 3,400 calories. By comparison, many German military installations were providing only 1,500 calories per day to their own personnel due to supply constraints. American prisoners were eating better than German soldiers in the field. The specific foods available in camp kitchens would have seemed incredible to men familiar with German rations. Eggs were served regularly at breakfast. Bacon accompanied those eggs. Potatoes appeared at most meals, prepared in various ways. Beef stew was a common dinner offering. Real coffee with actual sugar was available rather than the ersatz coffee made from roasted grain that had become standard in Germany. At Christmas 1943, Camp Herne prepared a feast that entered into prisoner mythology. Roast turkey with traditional dressing, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, buttered peas, pumpkin pie for dessert. Some accounts even mention cigars being distributed after the meal. One prisoner recorded in a letter that it was a feast beyond anything our families at home could imagine. The fact that prisoners were eating like kings while their relatives starved created profound cognitive dissonance. This was not sentimental charity on America's part. The generous treatment was calculated policy rooted in Geneva Convention requirements, but also in practical considerations. Washington understood that humane treatment would yield strategic advantages. Well-fed, healthy prisoners were less likely to cause problems. More importantly, prisoners who returned home after the war with positive experiences of American captivity would become informal ambassadors, spreading stories that might influence post-war German attitudes toward the United States. Still, to men who had been raised on propaganda about Anglo-American cruelty and decadence, the reality of their treatment felt like entering an alternate universe. "We expected them to starve us," one former sergeant admitted decades after the war. "Instead, we gained weight. We became healthier as prisoners than we had been as soldiers." The contradiction was impossible to ignore or explain away using the framework they had been given. If America treated its enemies better than Germany treated its own people, what did that say about the competing systems? The question haunted many prisoners and would continue to do so long after they returned home. The Americans were fighting tyranny not merely with superior firepower, but with abundance itself. The psychological impact of this approach was profound and lasting. But abundance was only part of what prisoners would experience. As they moved beyond the immediate shock of arrival and medical processing, as they settled into the rhythm of camp life, they would discover that America was prepared to show them even more. The journey into American territory continued not just physically, but psychologically, as everything they saw contradicted everything they had been taught to believe.